Wanted to do an update on where I'm at as far as creating 10 pieces for the upcoming online event with Livingston. And this is my first painted piece. It has been quite a struggle. I've got a couple weeks left and I'm a little nervous. I think I may end up with more like 5 pieces, but we'll see. Anyway, I wanted to show you what I'm struggling with as far as this piece goes and how I think I'm going to fix things. I have almost thrown this piece out multiple times. So we have some rips going on here. You can see the nice crisp tape lines. The tape decided to take the paper with it. Let's see, another issue. I painted a little too close to the edge here. You're seeing these marks right here. I'll show you how I got those in a moment. They're from masking fluid, because I originally started off with this piece as a watercolor piece. And the layers are okay. I need to do a little bit more with this to make it feel a little better. It's still a little rough. It needs some refining and some detail. But let's start at the beginning and I will show you how we got here, what worked and what didn't up to this point, and then I'm going to show you the different ways that I'm going to attempt to fix the piece. Originally, I had the idea that I would have the silhouette of a house in the background of the watercolor piece, and I was going to use masking fluid over this sketch to achieve that effect. I started off by creating a chartreuse wash, a very light wash of the watercolor over the background, and then my goal had been I would remove the masking fluid and that would leave the silhouette of the house within the background. I then started applying the watercolor to the rest of the parts of the painting, and I think this is where I made my first mistake. I am not an expert with watercolor at this point in time. I'm sort of, as a mixed media artist, more of a jack of all trades. I can pull bits and pieces from different types of medium, and I'm most comfortable with acrylic paint. And I layer all the different medium, using them as tools to get the outcome that I wanted. 2025 is the year that I want to change that, and I want to start improving my skills within specific medium and focusing on one medium. Now, why I chose to do that for an event, I don't know. This online exhibition, it's not a good idea to try something new that you're not good at. So I kind of fought with the watercolor a bit. I wasn't happy with the overall look of the bird, and things just felt wrong and splotchy. And I'm also not using the best grade of watercolor. It's a student grade, and I wasn't getting the pigment results that I wanted. At the point that I was doing this, I had not yet gotten better with water control. I'll show you my watercolor sketchbook in another video, but I have been working on improving my water control with watercolor, and it's going to take time. So again, I'm not sure why I chose to use that as the medium for a project that was going to go on exhibition. Anyway, partway through, I decided that maybe I needed to abandon the watercolor, and I did switch to acrylic. I also had some issues with the masking fluid. I realized every time I opened the bottle that it smelled quite a bit, and the masking fluid had gone off. It basically was bad. So it was sticking to the paper in ways that it shouldn't have been. You can kind of see it here. It looked like a boogery mess on the page. It was awful. And I thought I was going to have to throw out the whole sheet. But then I thought maybe I can save it with watercolor, or not with watercolor, with acrylic. And I started using that instead. So I've taken this out of the book so that I can work with it without damaging any of the other pieces in the sketchbook. I had thought the tape would prevent me from having the paint cross over, but you can see this was like a warm-up watercolor page I was doing. No, I got paint on it anyway, even though I was using tape at the time. So tape is not evidently the solution for me. I do like the crisp lines, and I need to find a way to fix these tears. I do have some rough texture to the page because of what the masking fluid did. And I'm just going to have to live with that. I've come back in and corrected the missing pieces where the masking fluid did come up and leave some spots in the acrylic paint. But watercolor paper has layers to it, and I don't know how easy it will be for you to see, but when it took this gouge out, there's almost like 3 very subtle thin layers of paper. So coming back in with more acrylic paint and trying to square this off, while that could be a solution, it's still going to show that textured layer underneath. What I'm going to do instead, I have basically a nail file here. I am going to distress this piece further. And I want to think about the composition of the piece as I do that. There is something called the visual triangle. You can also do something with a diagonal flow, and I sort of have a diagonal flow going now, like you have from this corner up through to this corner. But if I find another small space, and it doesn't have to be big, I can very gently rip and take off the paint and the paper right here. So let's cause a little bit more distressing here and just push this. And you may need to do this in sort of a rounded motion to get some of this off. So see, now I've got 3 spaces where a layer of that paper has come off. So I've got 1, 2, 3 spaces outlining the figure a bit more. Now, I wanted to experiment a bit more with the outlining on this and see what I can do with it. I have filled this empty paint pen with acrylic ink. If you've watched my other video where I refill my Posca pens, I use acrylic ink in these pens. It's very much like having a paint pen of your own without having to mix the paint at all. So I have this color by Daler Rowney that happens to be an olive green that I think matches with the chartreuse. I tested it a little bit up here, and I think it complements it enough. So what I'm going to start off by doing, I could frame the entire thing in parts, but I think I'm just going to subtly use the tip of this, and you could use a fine tip brush too. I'm just going to sort of outline maybe a few sections, and then I'm going to take a wet brush and just diffuse it a little bit more. Kind of use it to add some shadowing in there. And it's blending in a lot more than I expected it would. And now I'm coming off the page. So I just think I did something I didn't want to do. Let's try to take some of that off there. We're going to go ahead and fix that. So see, sometimes experiments just don't work. There we go. Okay, so we're not going to wet it then. What we are going to do is just make a few subtle lines in different spots here. To that frame. And just a couple spots along the edges here. And because of the way the paper is ripped here, it fits just almost right in that groove. You just kind of do it, whatever feels right, place it. So there is that. I think I'm also going to use this acrylic ink in some of these areas here to add a little bit more shading. And then the next step will be to use the paint pens on the feathers. Let's try this. Open this back up. You could also just make a wash out of some acrylic paint. I'm just going to put a tiny bit of this here. Dampen my brush a bit. So then what I want to do is I want to just wet the brush again and then just kind of take some of this and just pull it while the brush is wet and shade that area just ever so slightly. Another option is to use something like the Inktense pencils, which I may be using as well on the face. So I get the darkest color closest to the figure and then dampen the brush again and pull to get a wash out of the shadows. And you can even see here where the paint lifted it up just a bit. It's kind of running into a ridge line. When you need to, never else fails, rub with your fingers. Okay, so we're just getting very subtle, darker washes of color in here. And then now that I've gotten that in there, I'm going to take a little bit of this lighter chartreuse here. And I'm just going to take a tiny bit on my finger and gently kind of rub it and allow it to mix in. I use my fingers a lot, and if you do that like me, you want to make sure the pigments you're using are safe for that. So now you can see the different slight pops of color there. We've got more of that very subtle shading. Let's come around, and you can move your piece, rotate it if that helps. Let's just come in here. Some of these will just leave dark because of where they are. Dampen my brush a bit again, and then just kind of smooth that out into there so you get kind of a nice blended wash in there. Now I'm going to come back over the top of this, but I can very gently take this and then just rub in the color without losing the design. So I'm just kind of then able to easily add a little bit of shading. So I'm going to finish this, and then I'm going to work out how I am going to add the details in. I always debate, do I want to do dots? Do I want to do lines? How do I want to do this? We go. So I'll come back in a minute and probably do a sped up video of when I'm adding in all the details, because I'll just be using these different paint pens to do that. I decided I wanted to do a little more than just paint pens, and I came back in to do a little bit of hand stitching and decided I also wanted to layer in some more watercolor paper. So what I'm doing here is I am using a sheet of carbon paper to copy the image of this key onto a scrap piece of watercolor paper. I will then paint the key, cut it out, and stitch part of the key to the painting. And this will add some natural shadowing in, it'll add some more texture, and definitely create a more interesting piece. Painting the key allows me to adjust the shape and size of the key just a little bit. And my plan is to have the key hang slightly over that green border edge to create just a little more interest to the piece. I used a craft knife to cut the key out, and I'm going to save the other pieces of watercolor paper scraps for other parts of the project. With the key cut out, I can now add it to the project itself. I'm using a little bit of matte medium. I won't be gluing the entire part of the key down. I want to leave the upper portion of the key slightly lifted up so that I can slide the thread underneath and make the appearance that the key is hanging from a thread held by the bird's mouth. So I'm using these two needles. One is a very thin, long bead needle, and the other is a regular embroidery needle. I'm not going to use the embroidery needle on the page itself. It's very sharp, so I'm using it to poke the holes in the watercolor paper because the watercolor paper is extremely thick. I'm then going to use the bead needle because it's thinner to stitch with. I'm trying to keep the hole in the paper as small as possible. So when I'm poking that embroidery needle in, I'm not pushing it all the way through. I'm just using the sharp tip to create a very small hole. With the beading needle on some papers, it is sharp enough that you can stitch with it on some papers, but this watercolor paper is just super thick, so I need a little bit of extra help. And again, I don't want a very large hole. I also advise only poking a few holes at a time. That way you don't get lost as to where you're going to go with your stitching. It's not like stitching on fabric. It's a little bit different. So I just poke a few holes at a time as I'm working. Once I get the key stitched in, my plan is to stitch the beak over the top and have that thread hanging and looking exactly like it's hanging from the bird's mouth. I'm then going to use embroidery floss to accent certain portions of the painting. I'm not going to stitch all of it. That would be a lot of work. If I were planning to stitch more of it than I'm going to do, I would probably then want to work on fabric instead of paper. When you start poking a lot of holes in paper, you also run the risk that the paper is going to rip or tear from the structure of the paper being weakened. And I've lost my train of thought. That was just a moment, sorry. But It's not hard to stitch on paper. You need to think about it in layers. So this is where I've layered on the key. Then what my plan is to layer this entire painting onto another piece of watercolor paper. But because paper is very thick, it then becomes harder to stitch the more layers you have, especially depending on the type of paper. And again, with the watercolor paper being thick, I've got to think about the layers as I'm doing this. As I'm working on the paper, you'll notice that I'm flipping it back and forth quite a lot, making sure that I am stitching in the correct space and putting the needle through the correct hole. You're also not going to want to pull your thread tight. If you do that, you run the risk of tearing or pulling the paper. You can actually end up pulling the thread, like especially when you first start and you've knotted the thread a little bit, you can, if you pull it too tight, pull the thread completely through the hole and make the initial hole you made larger. So you want to be very gentle. So you want to pull it taut, but not so tight that you're going to tear or weaken the paper structure further. It's going to take me a long time to probably stitch all of this. Not as long as you might think with fabric, I guess, but long enough that the video would get incredibly long were I to do that. So I'm going to do the majority of the stitching off screen and show you the results. But from this video, you get the idea of what I'm doing. And again, when you're flipping the paper, one more thing, be careful you're not bending or curling the paper too much, that you're not holding it too tightly in your hand. With the acrylic paint, I don't have to worry so much, but some media, like watercolor, if you start to sweat a lot, if your hands get sweaty, if you're warm, you run the risk of reactivating the media. So keep that in mind as well as you're stitching. I still have more stitching to do, but I stopped real quick to show you the stitching that has been completed. This is just very simple mark making. I tend to not use very complex stitches when I am working on paper. So the most complex thing I've done here is this French knot in the string, but you'll notice everything is a very simple running stitch, basically a spot where I come in and a spot where I go out. Even when I'm doing smaller stitching, like here on the feet, very simple stitching. I tend not to want to do anything that might cause for me to tear or rip the paper. And this color is so close to that blue paint, I think I'm going to have to come in with a lighter accent color on here. But I've got a lot more stitching to do. And again, trying to keep the holes small, because what you'll notice, see right here, that little white dot, if the holes get very large, you're going to see the paper core through your piece. Now you can dab a tiny bit of paint over it, but it's kind of there. The other option would be that I can stitch with another piece of thread to hide it. This is a problem that occurs also with stitching on canvas. So that's something to think about when you're making the holes on your piece. Again, that's why you want to keep them small. You want to reduce seeing the core of the paper through the bottom. So when I come back next, the piece should be done as far as the top stitching on this layer. And then I'm going to show you how I'm going to fix the feathers here. Choosing to stitch the lips proved to be a mistake. The area is very tiny, it was prone to ripping, and I couldn't get the stitches I wanted. To hide the holes in the mistake I had made, I cut lips from watercolor paper, painted them, and then glued them back onto the piece. Once everything was stitched, I used some tape. This is like a double stick scrapbooking tape. It's acid free, and I used some matte medium to glue this sheet down to a larger sheet of watercolor paper. To ensure that the paper doesn't lift up even though it's glued, I added in some simple stitching at various points around the page where the dark lines had been created before. I also created a butterfly by painting it on scrap watercolor paper, cutting it out, and then adding it to the page. I added in little stitched antennae And I finished the painting off by adding some contrast over the thread that had been there previously. That thread had kind of blended in, and by putting a little bit of acrylic paint over the top of it, I was able to highlight it. I used a lighter color acrylic paint so that I would get the two tones of color that I desired. Earlier on, I had pointed out my mistake with cutting off some of the feathers from the painting. Gluing it to the larger sheet allowed me to correct that. I was able to paint in additional elongated feathers and stitch over the top of them. This also created visual interest as I was sort of crossing a border. I did end up using this color palette throughout the rest of the series and the same techniques as well. You'll see this series as part of the series Under the Same Sky with Anne Livingston, and she will have a live video showing all of the artists' work who participated in this challenge on April 11th. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.